Okay, so today I want to talk about this is something that came when I read a piece in the LA Times by Granderson, and it's again it goes. I mean, I gave away part of the punchline during the panel discussion that I'm now thinking of things that there's at least there's a we know philosophers, lumpers and splitters. All philosophers are splitters in the sense that we're always making distinctions, and then we're just trying to argue over what is the most fruitful distinction and one that captures something about the world. And this is the distinction that I've been thinking about more about whether or not whether we're even really talking about theories at all or theorists at all, as much as other things that might be going on or what things might be doing using the idea of conspiracy theories as the kind of the stalking horse. So I'm going to introduce the topic and point about how it points to some ways in which I want to kind of expand on earlier work I've done about conspiracy theories, and by looking at some actual cases of conspiracies. It's one of the things that when I got into talking about conspiracy theories is that within philosophy, we often talk about toy examples, or we were talking before about the barn facades. There's a whole history in philosophy of making up examples in order to then draw conclusions about them. And I came from a tradition within philosophy where it's like, well, let's look at actual things, right? Like the old joke as a philosopher is somebody who says, yeah, we know that it's possible in practice, but what we're interested in is it possible in principle, right? The absurdness of that joke is this idea of like, well, let's see what happens in practice. So let's look at, not, the made up idea of conspiracy theory, but let's look at actual conspiracy theories that have been presented and looking at the details of them. Starting with introduction, like I said, if you ask people today who's a conspiracy theorist, I mean, I think the poster boy for conspiracy theories these days is Alex Jones, right? I mean, he's usually referred to in the press as conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, right? So it becomes just a descriptor that often gets dropped onto him. And LZ Granderson, who's normally writes, he started, like David Icke, or he started out in more sports journalism, but has become more politically oriented in recent years as a columnist at the LA Times. And he wrote this nice piece back in 2022 called Alex Jones is No Kind of a Theorist. And he, talking about Alex Jones, and this was in the middle, I think one of the trials against Jones had been settled, and there was another trial that was still coming. So Alex Jones was in the news a lot at that time about the various trials around Sandy Hook. And he says of him, I don't like the phrase conspiracy theorist to describe people like Alex Jones, because people like Jones are not quote unquote theorists. They're snake oil salesmen. And the argument here is he basically says, it's a short piece. He basically says, he's not a theorist because he just doesn't do the things that you'd expect a theorist to do, right? Theorists would be more like scientists, he says, building on knowledge with hypotheses, perhaps even testing them with research and experiments with controls, collecting data. They check to see whether the theories are true, right? And he goes on to point out that doesn't seem to be what's going on in the case of somebody like Alex Jones as qua conspiracy theorist. Well, this raises the idea, and many of you already know this, right? But this idea that there are other accounts of like how to understand what a conspiracy theory is. Is it really theory, literally a theory, right? There's this idea that maybe we should think of conspiracy theories as a form of social signaling, right? So you're basically you're putting up your hand and saying I'm on team X or I'm on team Y, and then I use the expression of conspiracy of a particular theory or a particular conspiracy theory is basically a flag to say, I'm on this team as opposed to another team. Or, as Jan Williams has written about in other places, that maybe they're a form of entertainment. We've talked about, Katarina talked about how, they're fun in a lot of ways, right? It's entertaining to kind of think through the possibilities of conspiracy theories. And then Granderson makes the point is like, well, there's another role that conspiracy theories can play. They can be great for your bottom line, right? There for years, as he says, Jones has been making millions from his conspiracy theories. He's making millions from lies, right? And as I point out, as the kids say, it's a grift, right? That's the role of conspiracy theory for somebody like Alex Jones. And what that got me thinking about, the reason why this particular piece grabbed me, is like, okay, if I miss the point of this, or if or maybe, like I said, I think as I said in the panel discussion, I think the idea of conspiracy theories has shifted over the last 20 years that I've been working on it, or 25 years almost now. Is the idea that people weren't making, there were people making money off of conspiracy theories in 1997, but they were people who were selling a couple of books, right? They weren't, the people who were writing books about what we now think of as conspiracy theories. They weren't making lots of money. And now there's a lot of people who are making lots of money, including raising millions of dollars for political campaigns that they can spend, right? So that's not it's a relatively new phenomenon in thinking about that. Most people went broke, pushing particular kinds of conspiracy theories that we're interested in. As I mentioned in the first international meeting that we had online, right? There were like Mort Saul basically ruined his career. Right, and couldn't get bookings as a stand-up comedian because he wouldn't get off the conspiracy theory thing. And so it's an interesting shift in our culture whereby now conspiracy theories can be used as a grift, whereas before it might have been a grift before, but it was a pretty bad grift, right? It was not making much money. But what I realized, thinking through this shift is that, back when I wrote the paper in 1999 about conspiracy theories, I was talking about like, where do conspiracy theories, like what's the starting point for a given kind of conspiracy theory? And I pointed out that there were two different kinds of places where things could start. There's errant data and contradictory data, right? So errant data is evidence that isn't explained by the official story. So in the example that I gave originally about the Oklahoma City bombing, right, there was two drawings of John Doe number 1 and John Doe number 2. And you look at the picture of John Doe number 1 that was drawn out, it looks like Timothy McVeigh, right? It's a pretty good image of Timothy McVeigh. John Doe number 2, who was seen at the same place, and that's why we got a drawing of John Doe number two. It's never really been connected to anybody associated with Oklahoma City bombing. The official story doesn't really have an explanation of, it's just, maybe it was just somebody standing in line at the rental store that, was standing next to Timothy McVeigh, but had nothing to do with it. He's just some innocent. But we don't know, right? It's just it's a piece that's left unexplained. That then becomes the kernel that, a conspiracy theorist then grabs onto, like, who was it? Maybe that was the ATF plant that was encouraging McVeigh and kind of putting him up to the whole thing, or somehow, playing a role in the conspiracy. The other place where conspiracy theories start is with what I call contradictory data that's not just unexplained. This is more getting into the kind of irrationality, possibly, about things that seem to just run counter to what, it's not that they're unexplained, that they're actively argued against. So supposedly, Timothy McVeigh, it's supposed to be a contradictory piece of data that, he was caught because he was driving a car without license plates from the bombing, right? And he's supposed to be this mastermind who's smart enough to put together this whole operation, but then he drives off without a license plate. He might as well have a license, driving a car that says "arrest me," right? That just seems like a really stupid thing to do. And I think there's different explanations as to why that might have been the case. But again, this seems to runs contradictory to the official story that we're being told. So that I saw as the starting point of a lot of conspiracy theories. And what Keeley Granderson's got me thinking is that there are other starting points that I should also take into account. One is your starting point might just simply be lies, right? And somebody like Alex Jones just lies all the time. He just makes shit up and then creates a conspiracy theory based on that. And that's not a contradictory data, that's not errant data, that's just making up new data. Or there's also a group of things that are kind of like lies, but they're not really lies, because in some sense they're true, but they're only true because the person who's creating the conspiracy theory kind of makes them true. And so I wanted to kind of explore these two other possibilities. So we're all familiar with fabrications that are the start of conspiracy theories, right? You could just, put together the protocols of the elders of Zion, which seems to be a completely made up play. It's both, it's not only a lie, it's actually even a pretty bad lie, because there's plagiarizing from other people who lie, right? It's adding in new sorts of stuff. But then it is sold as, this is the actual protocols of the elders of Zion. It's the Jewish conspiracy. Here it is, the meeting minutes from the meeting. But it seems to be a complete and utter fabrication. And then from that, you build a conspiracy. Or one of my favorite ones, the more modern one, is something like, this was seen after 9/11, right? This, this email went around, and some of us got this email about, oh, here's this, amazing thing that you discover that, they actually predicted in the fonts, the Wingdings font and the Webdings font, what was going to happen in 9/11. So here's the email that says, subject is scary. One of the planes that hit the Trade Center towers was flight number Q33NY. So open up a Word document, type in the letters Q33NY, highlight it, enlarge it to font 48, click on the font style and select Wingdings, and what do you get? You get clearly playing than a Jewish star, the Star of David. And it's like, I mean, come on, this can't be a coincidence, right? I mean, this had to have been built in, except where there's a problem with this, right? Q33NY has nothing to do with 9/11. And that wasn't one of the numbers of the planes. It wasn't even an ATM or an air traffic control number that some people tried to say. No, this seems like this was something that was back engineered because in an earlier version of actually in Wingdings, if you type in NYC, you get you actually get these last two symbols, right? And this was actually a big embarrassment for Microsoft when they did this, because they just not realized that when they coded it, NYC came up as this kind of Jewish star and death sign, like it was really embarrassing. So when they came out with Webdings, which was an update to it for the web, a font, they changed it so that when you typed in NYC, you would get a picture of an eye, a heart, and then the city thing. So it's like I heart New York, right? It was there to kind of make up for it. So the idea that you might actually be presenting stuff or presenting and communicating to the world via Webdings and Wingdings and so forth was an idea that had been around. But here's somebody whoever created this, they must have known that they were just making something up. And maybe the first person who created it was doing a joke, right? And then that context is like, oh, here's a funny joke. But then other people picked it up, maybe without knowing it. But in some sense, it's starting with a lie, right? That just Q33NY has nothing to do. It just, it starts with the idea that this is something to do with 9/11. No, it's just a fabrication. But that seems different to me than the other idea of kind of fabricated facts. And my favorite example of this is from Hunter Thompson, who on Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail had this great moment. And for those of us who like kind of satirical politics and writing about politics, he writes that this originally was in the Rolling Stone. The headline was, Big Ed Muskie exposed as an Ibogaine addict, right? This kind of staid a politician in running for the presidency in 1972 says, there was no doubt about it. The man from Maine, that's Muskie, had turned to taking massive doses of Ibogaine. The only remaining question is, when did he start? But no one can answer this, and I was not able to press the candidate himself because I had been permanently barred from the Muskie campaign, and so forth. But he's reporting on these rumors that the drug use amongst this particular political candidate. And then he points out later in a CBC interview, and 5 years later, he says, I never said that Muskie was taking Ibogaine, he explains. I said there was a rumor in Milwaukee that he was doing so, which I know to be true because I started to read it. Right? So there's a sense in which this isn't a lie. It is true. There was a rumor about him using Ibogaine. But there's something still hinky about this whole process because, well, why is there a rumor? Well, because I started the rumor, right? And this strikes me as similar to the sort of thing that we see today, where people will talk about, wow, the title of the book. A lot of people are saying, based on looking at contemporary politics, of this kind of trope that happens. It's like, well, people on Twitter are talking about such and such, and the fact that this is not being picked up by the mainstream media or the lamestream media, shows that there's some kind of conspiracy. But then it's pointed out, it's like, well, why are people talking about this? It's because you have 1 million followers and you posted it, right? And then you've got enough followers who will repost it. I mean, the only reason a lot of people are saying is because you said it. Right, or that you're in some sense the star. So yeah, in some sense it's not a lie. A lot of people are saying, but the only reason you're saying it is because you're presenting it to the people. So So thinking of these as two additional places where conspiracy theories can start, again, this takes me back to kind of thinking about this as a philosopher of science and how, how does this connect with the idea of any kind of explanation, or particularly scientific types of explanation? Because I pointed out originally that at least the first two categories of unaccounted for and contradictory data, right, these are central to the scientific process, right? I mean, Kuhn talked about the role of anomalies in the development of new theories and new paradigms. Is, when Mercury isn't quite where Newtonian theory tells you to expect Mercury to be, that anomaly then needs to be explained, and then on the basis of kind of pulling the string that's caused by exploring these anomalies, and as anomalies build up, you may then develop a new theory to kind of capture the anomalies together with the standard sorts of things. And as I always like to point out, Francis Crick, once said something about you don't want your theory to capture all the data because not all the data is in fact correct, right? Because there's always going to be errors in your data. So some anomalies are just always to be expected. But the kind of idea of unaccounted for data and contradictory data is kind of just part and parcel of scientific explanation. And in terms of lies, we also find those all the time in scientific explanation as well, right? There are things like Piltdown Man, right? Where people actually just make up scientific data that then they try to explain. Like, how do you explain Piltdown Man? It must have meant that there was, an important human evolution going on in Britain. And if you're British, that sounds great to you. But it's just a hoax and a fabrication, and we see that all the time. But also, partly as a sign that you see it all the time, is that we also have mechanisms in place with peer review and replication and so forth in order to try to catch those kinds of things and hopefully catch the hoaxers that might be doing this. And this is actually just a question for you, and please grab me afterwards if you've got an example of this. But with the fabricated facts, I'm been kind of racking my brain as to whether there's some parallel for fabricated facts in scientific cases. And I just haven't come up with a case where somebody kind of, has a false way of starting their scientific theory. Oh, you got one for me?
Like a setup for an experiment, for instance, with a very obvious selection bias?
Okay, that's a possibility, right? Is if you, but it has to be a theory that is false, right? I mean, a lot of times I think people they do it for innocent reasons, right, and just create a bad experiment. But it would have to be one in which somebody is going to create an experiment in order to make sure. Maybe there are some cases of this, yes.
Like I think from the 50s to the 90s, the cigarette lobby was heavily investing in research that was about making sure that cigarette doesn't provoke cancer, but it's just to soothe your lungs, and people that will have a cancer like to smoke cigarettes because it helps their lungs. And so they kind of fabricated the facts in that way.
Okay, yeah, that's good. I'll have to think through. That might be a possibility. Yeah, good. No, great. And if other people have examples, let me know. But another thing that we not only want to contrast conspiracy theories or look at them from a scientific perspective. I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking more about as time goes on, that maybe scientific explanation isn't the right model here for us to be thinking in terms of conspiracy theories, that it might be more something like law enforcement investigations, right? Not what scientists do, but what police detectives do, right? And look at what police detectives do, it's different in a lot of ways than what scientists do. But at the same time, you can see things like unaccounted for data and contradictory data are the sorts of things that are part and parcel of what a good detective is going to keep an eye out for, right? You're going to be expecting, somebody who's committed a crime to maybe want to cover up that crime, and so you're going to look for little holes in their alibi and so forth, as a way to explain things. So, finding the suicide handgun that supposedly somebody has just shot themselves to death with a suicide. You realize, wait, it's on their right side, but this person was left-handed, right? That little anomaly then might kind of come to saying that maybe this wasn't really suicide. Maybe this is something that's being set up to look like suicide. And as I say, Francis Crick's dictum is still appropriate as well. And at the same time, we have lies also often playing a role as well. There are always going to be untruthful detectives. There's going to be planted evidence. There's going to be untruthful acting for body cams, right? So things like that are things that we see in that. But also, we also see fabricated facts as well. And actually, I'm not quite sure whether untruthful acting for body cams, maybe more should be classed as as a fabricated fact. But we have all sorts of cases of things like entrapment by law enforcement or coerced confessions, which is like, yeah, this person really did confess to the crime, but only because you coerced them into that, right? So it is true they signed this document saying I did it, but that document was created in a way that you set up to make sure that happened. It's still not a factual starting point. So, and also pointing out that these are all considered pathologies for law enforcement, right? We need to put things in place to try to make sure our police officers and our detectives are, being accurate. That's why we record conversations and so forth in different jurisdictions have different ways of trying to control and making sure these kinds of pathological starting points are important. So I'm almost out of time, but I wanted to point out that part of what's going on here too is, as I was saying in the talk, is that there really seems to be maybe a different kind of motivation going on. I mean, not only is it, what Granderson is pointing to is that in some sense, when Alex Jones is doing what he's doing, he's not being either a police detective or a scientist, right? He's not offering these as a way of offering explanation. He's just trying to figure out, how do I get people to send money to me and use it as a drift. So when Granderson talks about it, he talks about it more in terms of part of what what somebody like Alex Jones is doing is less interested in explaining historical facts as much as trying to change the future in one way or another. That part of that shift from thinking about conspiracy theories in the terms of explanation, a scientific explanation, is there something looking backwards, right? It's trying to explain why things have happened in the past. Whereas what's going on in the case of somebody like Alex Jones and his conspiracy theories is that he's actually like thinking of the future, right? He's trying to get somebody elected. He's trying to get the laws of the country changed in particular sorts of ways. He wants to see the Second Amendment applied in particular sorts of ways. And so instead of trying to explain things, he's actually trying to bring about some kind of change, which means that really what he's doing is less about explanation than it is about propaganda, right? That basically this is all propagandizing, which is, by the way, similar to what detectives do when they get their head, they just, I know this guy did it, and therefore I'm going to try to make sure I do everything possible to get them, even if it means kind of playing fast and loose with things, because really the outcome I want is this person in jail, right? And it doesn't really matter whether it's factual necessarily. I have a goal here that's not just about explaining what happened to this victim. No, I have more of a goal of trying to get this person put behind bars or given the death penalty. And that's just a different goal for what's going on. And I think that in some sense I think this is part of what's going on with the particularism versus generalism today, that I think particularism makes more sense if you think of the target phenomenon as an explanation, right? And I think that, this idea of conspiracy theories as bad science is your model, I think is what, what I originally was talking about, but what I think others in philosophy here are talking about as well. But I think generalism makes more sense if you're thinking of the model of conspiracy theories as bad politics. And that and I think in some sense that's what's motivating people like Kassam and Reuter and Napolitano and others, is they're just not thinking of it as explanation at all. They're thinking of it more as playing this propagandistic role. And I think generalism makes more sense there because I just don't agree with the goals. So therefore anything that's trying to bring about those goals is bad. So this says about Kassam, right? Kassam gets to his conclusion that conspiracy theories suffer from the intellectual vice of gullibility by restricting belief in conspiracy theories to those which he takes that are irrational belief in the first place. As such, Kassam restricts the scope of what counts as a conspiracy theory in order to make a belief in such theories prima facie unlikely, right? But you kind of, it's an inappropriate bringing it in, tightening up the definition, because I think still the idea is that what he ought to be doing is talking about theories as explanations, whereas what Kassam and others have accused of people like Dentith and me as being apologists on behalf of conspiracy theories. And this is from somebody talking about Kassam's work, but saying Kassam, philosophy professor at work, arguing conspiracy theories are always a form of political propaganda. He says we must be aware of ideology they are pushing, and we must differentiate between the producers of conspiracy theories and those that believe in them. But again, kind of reconceptualizing what it is that conspiracy theories are as being, something as a political role as opposed to an explanatory role. And so I'm wondering to what extent, is some of the distinctions that we see. Like I said, I think psychologists don't become interested in conspiracy theories until it becomes a political thing. And then they're trying to figure out, how do I undermine that political goal? Whereas I think philosophers, particularly those philosophers that got into it before that, were thinking of it more as an explanatory thing. And we were just analyzing things in a different way. So hopefully at the end, I think I've shown you, hopefully convince you that there are different ways of thinking about conspiracy theories, and in particularly worrying about whether somebody like Alex Jones really should be thought of as a theorist at all, whether he's just a grifter or a liar who's doing something very different than maybe what we were doing with conspiracy theories 20 years earlier. So I'll leave it there.